economic conditions, better working conditions, all of that stuff pushed aside. Let's focus on the identitarian stuff. And the identitarian stuff by nature divides us and leads to more fights, more conflict, even among us. But that's the point. The biggest
Good evening and welcome to everybody who has joined the stream so far. Come to hear me defend dictatorships of the proletarian kind. And I wanted to do this after a particularly long and tedious train journey today, in which I was reduced to reading about the decline and fall of the socialist era in Poland, and how much of that could be traced to, of course, abandonment of core communist concepts, and including, of course, the abandonment in the Soviet Union of the concept of and the practice of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I wanted to say something about that because I think it's one of those ideas that, or one of those practices really, that most so-called Marxists don't defend. Most don't talk about it, and if they do, they'll get embarrassed about it and pretend it's something that it's not, because the bourgeoisie has been very effective at attacking this idea because, of course, like most of the successful ideas of the Marxist-Leninist tradition, the dictatorship of the proletariat proved very effective at suppressing guess who? The bourgeoisie and their allies. So this is obviously something that they put an awful lot of time and effort into attacking, and unfortunately the major center of revolution in the world joined in those attacks and helped them go further. And I refer, of course, to the foul and disgusting and despicable abomination known as Khrushchev and his revisionist tendency that he began in 1956 with his attacks on, well, his attacks were nominally on Stalin, but in actual fact they were on the whole revolutionary process. That's what he was doing. So before we get into it, though, I will do the customary scout through the chat. As I said, if you've not liked or shared the stream, be sure to do so. I might even get some liberals coming along, who knows. So hello to Red Star Betty, hello to Lavitz, hello to Sneaks, hello to Ash over there in Melbourne, hello to my comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project, and hello to Beiju, comrade out there in Barnet, hello to Slava over in Chicago, hello to James Graham, hello to Roddy, and we are underway. So, as I said, wanted to talk about this due to the reading I've been doing recently on Poland and the decline and fall of the people's democracies in the 1980s, and how much this was down to the, capitalist trends creeping in, openly encouraged by Khrushchev, Kosygin, Brezhnev, and other leaders, and how the abandonment of the dictatorship of the proletariat by Khrushchev in favor of his woolly and opportunistic slogan of a state of the whole people, which is something, by the way, that the Chinese leadership has copied, and how this led to a rotting away of the power of the proletariat and the imposition of a more and more pro-capitalist leadership, which was growing in line with the growth of, in the Soviet case, pro-capitalist elements within the state and the economic management of society, and the growth of this illegal underground capitalist economy in the USSR, which was matched by similar developments in the people's democracies, till of course they had a underground capitalist economy by the late 1980s, combined with pro-capitalist tendencies of various kinds all the way across the hierarchies of the ruling communist parties. From everybody now remembers people like Slobodan Milosevic, but we forget where he got his start, which was he was a Titoite official and a banker, and he was this pro-capitalist who wanted to do business with the West and ended up getting completely fucked over by them. But he was actually very typical of the kind of man who was occupying the offices of state and the parties in these countries when the collapse came. And the cost, as we've covered on many programs in the past, the cost, of course, of the failure of socialism, its internal collapse, has been enormous, and it the cost covers, of course, every country that we talk about here, from last night when we're talking about Niger to our regular programs on Ukraine, and the cost there is now incredibly obvious. And of course, the men that ushered in this decline and fall are still praised to the heavens and back by the capitalist press, because of course they did the imperialists an enormous service. Gorbachev will be basically forever a saint of the Church of Capitalism, because of course it was through him and his collaborators, people like Yakovlev and the other so-called moderates in the Politburo at the time, people like Ligachev, who was also almost as responsible as Gorbachev for the failure of and the collapse of the Soviet Union. They will always be remembered very, very fondly in the imperialist capitals, because that's who they ultimately served. And the reason, I think, for a lot of this is the fact that the dictatorship of the proletariat became something which the opportunists and the revisionists didn't want to defend it, but they wanted to practically undo it wherever they could. And it's an idea and a practice that has always been attacked ferociously by the various forms of reformist that have sprung up to attack the Bolshevik revolutionary tradition ever since the revolution took power in 1917. And the first one to actually oppose this is, of course, our old friend Karl Kautsky. Now, if you're not familiar with who Karl Kautsky is, he was one of the leaders, and certainly the leading theoretician of what was regarded as revolutionary Marxism before 1914. Before, of course, the German SPD threw itself behind the war plans of the German imperialists, and we all know what happened after that. But prior to that, Kautsky was he was regarded as the teacher by Lenin, by Rosa Luxemburg, and many, many others. He was quoted favorably by Stalin. The entire Second International leadership of the Socialist International, all the leaders of the different parties all looked up to Kautsky, and he was the man who was, of course, an old friend of Engels. He had led the fight against Bernsteinism and the first emergence of reformism, and the argument being made by Bernstein in the early 1900s was that you could reach socialism without the need for a revolution. And Kautsky leads the opposition to that. So he had this huge reputation, which was deservedly shot to pieces by his waffling and wavering over World War I, which, of course, Lenin eviscerated him for, and the fact that the German SPD endorsed the imperialist war plans of the Kaiser and his generals and the German ruling class, as did, by the way, all of the major Second International parties, including those who clung to woolly pacifism, even though, of course, some of those were involved in the refounding of an international around the so-called Zimmerwald left. But the decline and fall of Kautsky was complete when, of course, after the revolution, the whole machinery of the Second International was then dedicated towards not, of course, fighting the capitalist system that had just condemned millions and millions of working class people, mostly working class men, to die in the trenches of World War I. It was dedicated and turned over towards fighting the influence of revolutionaries. And it was at this moment, of course, that the Second International in the late 1920s reconfigured itself wholly and completely into a tool of imperialism. And that's what it's been ever since. It's still around today, the so-called Socialist International. Jeremy Corbyn used to twat about at it, pretending that it meant something. It does mean something. It's a tool of imperialism and has been for 100 years and is completely dedicated to that. So the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat was subject to a fierce controversy between Lenin and Kautsky. Kautsky, of course, trying desperately to, again, hedge and fudge and waver, had helped to found something called the USPD, which is the independent SPD, which was the SPD left, who had been either anti-war or pacifist, who had left the main body of the SPD after the German Revolution was cut short by the SPD leaders in their squalid deal that they struck with the German bourgeoisie, whereby the SPD leaders would get to run a bourgeois democratic republic for a while in return for preserving capitalism and suppressing the revolution, which in the end they did, of course, via the usage of paramilitary death squads known as the Freikorps, who infamously murdered Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht on the orders of people like Philipp Scheidemann, Friedrich Ebert, and Gustav Nosk, the SPD leaders who, of course, all knew Luxemburg and Liebknecht for many, many years. And, of course, these men are still remembered fondly to this day by people like Paul Mason. And why wouldn't they be? They're exactly the model of what he wants to be. So Kautsky forms this halfway house, this USPD, and he attacks the Bolsheviks for destroying democracy, as he puts it. Now, this is where you know, whenever somebody who was previously a Marxist starts babbling about democracy without the added descriptor of, well, what kind of democracy, you know that they're taking an opportunist turn. Because, of course, democracy, to rehash A-level politics here for you, comes from the ancient Greek terms demos and kratia, and, of course, the literally rule of the majority. And of course, the term originally referred to Greek city-states where only male property holders had the right to vote. Women didn't. And, of course, the laboring force, which was the slaves, didn't. And so that's the original ancient Greek democracy, very similar to the ancient Roman democracy. And then, of course, you have various iterations of democracy throughout the feudal period, a democracy in which only about 10 elector counts could vote, or a democracy in which a bunch of merchant princes could vote and elect a chief merchant prince, or an elector kingdom, or some small merchants' council. And as we go into the capitalist period, you, of course, get bourgeois democracy, which in its original form is rather honest when it's described by people like John Locke and others like him, who were writing in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. They're very clear. It's a democracy, again, of the property-holding rising bourgeoisie. And you get through to the socialist period and you have proletarian democracy. So democracy, again, a very old term coming from the old Greek, is something which has meant different things according to, well, which class holds the power. And that should be basic, sort of elementary Marxism, really. Such a term that has been around for thousands of years, from the time of the old Greek city-states, means different things at different times, and according to which class is in power and which class is the exploited class or exploited classes. So you start to get Kautsky babbling on about how Lenin and the Bolsheviks have destroyed democracy when they, of course, they terminated the Constituent Assembly, arguing that it was now a relic of a bygone era, the era of bourgeois democracy, which would come to an end in Russia when power passed to the Soviets in October 1917. And to keep that around would have invited that institution to, of course, attract support from the bourgeoisie, for the bourgeoisie to use it to try and carry out a counter-revolution or to aid a counter-revolution. And, of course, in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, you did have still councils of workers' deputies, because in the German Revolution of 1918, where the working class, starting with the sailors of the Baltic Fleet, revolted against their officers who had tried to order them out to sea for one last glorious confrontation with the British Navy, which would, of course, have ended up with them all being sunk and killed. They revolted. Many of them killed their officers who'd ordered them on this suicide mission. This was in the naval port of Kiel. Then the mutiny turned into a general strike, spread like wildfire all the way across the country. There were suddenly Soviets popping up all the way across the army, the navy, and all the way across the working class and peasant areas of Germany. It was a mass workers' revolution which was only derailed by the active assistance of the SPD leaders, who unfortunately still carried a lot of authority with them at the time, enough to derail and destroy the revolutionary process. But they couldn't destroy those workers' councils straight away. They actually worked them into the constitution of the what's known now as the Weimar Republic. And so these workers' councils actually hung around for a little while into the 1920s, into the middle of the 1920s, in fact, when, of course, they were finally drained of all authority and just withered away, because all power in actuality lay in the hands of the bourgeois state, even though that bourgeois state was at various periods in the early 20s very, very weak, and there were multiple opportunities at which it could conceivably have been overthrown had the young German Communist Party been stronger. But that's a story for another day. Reason why I mention that detail is because where you have two sources of political, economic, and legal authority existing alongside each other, both representing two different classes and therefore two different forms of democracy, well, what you're going to get is one that both are going to attract the class forces to them, and you're going to end up in a dual power situation, and eventually you're going to end up in a situation where one has to be done away with. And the Bolsheviks did away with the Constituent Assembly early and avoided that becoming a real problem. You see it in the Spanish Civil War as well, where you have like various dual power situations which cause a lot of problems. You had also in more recent years, you have the dual power situation that existed between the revolutionary institutions of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela and, of course, the old bourgeois parliament, of which a certain Mr. Juan Guaido was the head of. And, of course, to get around the fact that this was such a huge barrier to the revolutionary process, the PSUV and the Bolivarian Revolution had to set up a constituent assembly of their own that more accurately reflected the voting base. And then, of course, these two institutions, the old parliament and the new parliament, the constituent assembly, suddenly get involved in a face-off, which ultimately concludes with Juan Guaido becoming Trump's man in Venezuela and then ultimately failing and becoming a meme. Point here is that where you've got these dual power situations, one of them, especially when you've got two different forms of democracy, one representing the masses, the other representing the bourgeoisie, that cannot continue for too long. It can continue for a while, especially if, like in the Spanish Civil War, there's an extreme crisis and there's a delicate balance of forces and the communists aren't in a position to actually push the revolution forward in the way that would have been ideal. But still, it remains an unstable situation when you have two different classes swinging behind two different forms of democratic authority. So this is where, of course, Kautsky, to return to him, starts, of course, fully showing the signs of completely degenerating into the worst kind of woolly opportunism when he starts babbling about democracy and not, of course, mentioning what kind of class content that democracy is to be, because it's clear from Kautsky's writing after 1914 and his actions that he favoured a bourgeois democracy because he favoured capitalism. Because why wouldn't he? Karl Kautsky and his ilk in the hierarchy of the German SPD had done rather well through being the loyal opposition to the Kaiser's government in Imperial Germany. And that, of course, really showed when they all voted for the war, because as many theorists, including, of course, most prominently Lenin and Stalin, pointed out, the hierarchy of the German SPD in the upper end of the working class and the trade union organizations that were tied to the SPD, and the same is true for the Parti Socialiste in France, the Labour Party in Britain. These had all been beneficiaries of colonialism, that upper end of the working class and in its political parties. And so, of course, they were going to want to preserve the system as it was, just with a few wage rises and maybe a bigger budget for the parliamentary representatives. And Karl Kautsky represents that corruption and corrosion and degeneracy that the Second International still represents to this day. And so when Lenin is arguing in written form with Kautsky and ripping him apart in quite ferocious terms, you start to see these arguments about, well, why are the Bolsheviks setting up a dictatorship? Why does it need to be that? Why can't it just be a democracy? And of course, this all comes back to the point about, well, the way in which society is structured. And I'll remind you of the old phrase of Marx, which is that the ruling ideas of any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. And if you're going to try and establish a workers' state, if you're going to try and establish or a workers' and peasant state, depending upon the balance of forces in a particular society, you're going to need to have a dictatorship of the ruling class. And if the ruling class is to be the proletariat, then it has to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, because what we have now and what they had back then, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And to deny that is completely foolish, because what's happened with the development of bourgeois states in the imperialist countries since the late 18th and early 19th centuries is, of course, this: you have the Enlightenment, you have the French Revolution, you have the radical impact of these philosophies of the individual, which are, of course, all about the bourgeois individual. And even with the most radical expressions of these bourgeois thinkers like Thomas Paine or Mary Wollstonecraft, you still have all the limitations that bourgeois concept of the individual brings with it. But of course, because they have to speak in universal terms about universal rights, about the rights of man as a whole, and they don't put in the million caveats that they ended up putting into the American Constitution, such as, well, when we said the Declaration of the Rights of Man, we meant a very specific type of man. It's still conducted in universalist language, which is, of course, why the Haitian Revolution was to lay claim to some of this and try and force their way into it. And I'll be coming back to the Haitian Revolution in a future episode, I'm sure. But it's also why, of course, that the proletariat starts to conduct its political struggles using the same language that the bourgeoisie has used. In Britain, they used to, in the days of the movement for the franchise, make appeals to ancient British liberties and freedoms. They used to make appeals to, well, the rights of man, to the Bill of Rights, to the battles for the rights of the individual during the time of the English Civil War, all drawing upon these traditions of the bourgeois revolution. And this is because, of course, the proletariat hadn't actually developed its own ideology yet. It was still, as Marxist-Leninism hadn't come about, as Marx was still in the very early period of his the development of this project in the 1840s. When you get something like the Chartists, it's conducted, albeit in class terms. The ideas are expressed in terms of that the bourgeoisies express them. So the proletariat in the 19th century in Britain and the early 20th century, and the same is true in the United States, and again, as I said, most of the imperialist countries, is able to force its way into the bourgeois system because of the amount of pressure they are able to bring to bear on the bourgeoisie, and the fear of the bourgeois that unless they reform, they'll end up like the old feudal aristocrats. So the proletariat is able to push its way into the bourgeois system to an extent. And of course, the tricks of the bourgeoisie were established very early on, that the amount which the proletariat could influence the system must be kept limited. And this is where you get useful things for the bourgeoisie, such as permanent bureaucracies, such as militaries that are barely under the control of civilian governments. They're only under the control of civilian governments when that government happens to be one that serves wholly and completely the class interests of the bourgeoisie. Even that feeble old fool Jeremy Corbyn had a potential military revolt talked about against him because of his rather watery pacifism. So just imagine what these people would do in case of an actual radical government getting in which communists were present. I think the coup would happen before you could blink, or that at least they'd attempt it before you could blink. So permanent, having power in permanent bureaucracies, having a military that was, of course, commanded by the hierarchy of a combination of the old aristocracy and the rising bourgeoisie, having, of course, a civilian police force, which is also commanded by either the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie, and even though the ranks of it are often made up with workers, these are workers who are taken out of the class, taken away from the class, and trained to be hostile to it. So you get a lot of innovations from the bourgeoisie as to how to overcome the fact that they had to give the proletariat, first, of course, proletarian men, and then finally, in our case, in 1929, all women. So remember, the entire proletariat has not even had the vote for 100 years under the bourgeois system. And so you do get, I think the last countries to give proletarian women the vote happened in the 1970s. I believe Switzerland was one of the last. But so the proletariat is able to force its way into this system because, of course, the bourgeoisie is caught in this antagonism, this contradiction that we often discuss here, which is that they hate and fear and loathe the proletariat and wish it would go away. Of course, they can't live without it. And, of course, all of their actions reflect this problem that they have, and that they would really like nothing else than to club the proletariat over the head repeatedly and tell it to get back in its hovel. The voting isn't for the likes of you. And they tried this in the early 20th century until the point when in British terms, I think it was in about 1830, the Duke of Wellington, former military commander and later prime minister, and has a reputation of being, even amongst bourgeois historians, of not being a particularly good prime minister. But his house, I think it's called Apsley House. You can still go and see it in London. It's in central London now, but back then London, of course, would have been a lot smaller, so it was sort of on the periphery of the countryside then. And he ended up with his house surrounded by angry proletarians protesting in favour of a reform bill. So he saw the writing on the wall and had to swing his support behind it and realised that they couldn't just militarily repress the proletariat. They had to offer some kind of reforms. And they did this in typical British bourgeois style by bringing in and co-opting some people, leaving behind others, building themselves a new coalition with bits of the petty bourgeoisie and bits of the upper working class. This is the style that they still try to operate to this day. And of course, the change in the laws, the inclusion of the proletariat in the electoral process, and of course the benefiting of the toppermost layer of the proletariat through the proceeds of colonialism, their increase in living standards, thanks to the fact that the super profits of empire were so big that they were able to throw a few extras at the toppermost end of the proletariat. Well, they were, of course, then looking at a situation where you had the Labour Party, you had these parties of the Second International, representing as they did mainly those top layers of the Labour aristocracy who were benefiting from imperialism and colonialism. Of course, those layers became very much in favour of the current system. And the current system was that it's, of course, a bourgeois dictatorship, but with some small elements of concessions to this toppermost layer. And, of course, this is why you have all these trade union leaders and these Labour Party leaders in this country and the Social Democrats in France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, all these places suddenly start, of course, more so than they had been already. Many of them had already been quite vague as to what socialism meant or how we were supposed to get there. Like, look at the likes of Keir Hardie, who's regarded as like a secular saint by the left. And you look at like people like James Maxton of the old Labour Party, and these were regarded as the big-time radicals. And their thoughts about socialism and how we were going to get there, it's all very vague. It's all sort of comes down to moralizing a lot of the time, vague commitments to a workers' government whilst never really saying what it is. So, of course, it's no surprise that all of this just collapses into support for bourgeois democracy. And the key word there is bourgeois, because as I've said, they've got 1,000 ways within the state machine to make sure that whatever gets elected follows a certain narrow path. Permanent bureaucracy, permanent military high command and bureaucracy, civilian police force, and of course the ideological methods of reinforcement, which come most directly through the bourgeois press, all owned and controlled by members of the bourgeoisie, and of course structured like any other bourgeois corporation. And then of course you get the wider propaganda aspect, which is the culture industry, to use a phrase from people I usually hate, but I think it's an apt phrase, because of course bourgeois ideology isn't just the stuff they hit you over the head with in the newspaper or on TV. It's everywhere. Bourgeois ideology is, of course, derived from the relations of production. The relations of production being bourgeois, being dominated by the bourgeois. And, of course, the ideology that comes along with them naturally reflects that. And that's the ideology in its most blunt terms, in terms of what they tell you to think in the news and in the printed press and now online. So that's the most blunt form of it, which you're getting via the news, or even more direct via the official belief systems of the bourgeois parties. But you have the much wider definition of it, which is more useful to work with, which is that, of course, bourgeois ideology is in everything. Because, of course, bourgeois relations of production affect everything. So the ideology that they create affects everything. And this is, of course, true in the form of film, in the form of TV, in the form of radio, not just in terms of news, but in terms of every single thing you see on there. Some of it is well made, some of it is not, some of it is subtle, some of it is crude, but they're all, from TV dramas to daytime soaps to quiz shows to teen dramas to horror movies. This is all a reflection of bourgeois ideology. They all have within them, of course, various aspects of bourgeois ideology which they are representing on screen or on the radio or on the internet, wherever you watch it. And of course, this is something which many Marxist academics have rendered this analysis into a harmless pastime, reading resistance narratives into Marvel movies or something like that, something impotent and stupid. But the fundamental core concept here is that we are surrounded by bourgeois ideology all the time. You go to work and you are subjected to the bourgeois relations of production. And you are subjected to the authority of the manager or the foreman or the company director or the HR manager, whatever system of corporate authority you have above you. And so that's a form of you getting bourgeois ideology drummed into your head. You're having in the workplace your place as a worker drummed into you by the system which you work under. But you have a much wider system of bourgeois ideology, which is, again, whether the people who make it know it or realize it or not, is about reinforcing the current relations of production. Because what it's doing is, and again, how could it not be? Because it's arising out of these relations of production. It's arising out of capitalist commodity production. It's constantly reinforcing class hierarchies, most of all, the natural rule of the bourgeoisie, how the system is basically okay, it's just got some defective elements within it which are solved by the hero at the end of the narrative. And all of this great tapestry, which of course Gramsci so excellently analysed in his work, which again I will have to come back to with some reading at group episodes on in the future, all of this constitutes ways in which the bourgeoisie reinforces their dictatorship, because that's what it is. They control, again, let's go back to the old phrase of Marx, they control all the aspects of the system that we live in. Again, let's just go through it again. They control how everything at work is structured. The influence of the trade union movement in Britain over how production was structured and organized was probably at its height between the early 50s and the middle 70s. Just that's very rough. Others may want to come in on precise dates there, but those are the points where the base of the trade unions, the ordinary worker, especially on production lines, especially in places like the car industry in Britain, American comrades may want to chime in if it was different over there, was able to actually make a real impact at the point of production via his or her militancy. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why the bourgeoisie prioritized busting up trade unions completely and destroying that rank and file capability, because it got to the point where ordinary workers were challenging the authority of the bourgeoisie at the point of production, albeit in ways which didn't lead to revolution, but it was a shock to the bourgeois that the unions had gotten, or the base of the unions, the workers, the ordinary rank and file activist in the unions, had gotten that far beyond their control. So that's the point where the point of production could be challenged by the proletariat was around about a 20-year period in this country. For the rest of the time since then, and certainly since the defeat of the miners' strike, it's been a relentless drumming down of any attempt by the proletariat to interfere with the holy rights of capital in the workplace is met with immediate dismantling and immediate firing of whoever tries to do it. And of course, instead of which, the bourgeoisie and their managers will hold many phony consultation exercises with the demoralized workforce. I'm sure whatever job you've done, whether you're in the public or the private sector, you will have gone through the excruciating agony of the boss asking you, what could we do better? At which point, nobody ever answers that question honestly, because if you did, you'd probably be fired, or even worse, promoted into the HR department. So my point here is that every single angle and every single aspect of our lives, from work to home life to our so-called leisure time, is dominated by the capitalist commodity production, bourgeois property relations, bourgeois relations in the workforce, the reinforcement of hierarchy, the reinforcement of bourgeois values in your home life, the reinforcement of all the foul and rotten prejudices of the bourgeois system in your personal life. Your money drains away from you instantly back into the cash nexus again because you have to constantly spend, and your paycheck disappears almost as soon as it comes in. All of this combines together to reinforce their complete dictatorship. And of course, since they defeated the trade union movement with the connivance of the trade union leaders, and since they were able to smash working class resistance in a lot of these countries in the 80s and 90s, the hold of the bourgeoisie has remained iron and vice-like over all aspects of our society. For a while after World War II, and thanks to the influence of the Bolshevik Revolution, the proletariat was able to actually contest that power for a little while. And even then, I think it was overstated just how much it was being contested. But it was a little, and that was too much for the bourgeoisie. They had to get rid of that. So, how is this all relevant to the dictatorship of the proletariat, you may ask? Well, when it comes to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, I hope I've demonstrated in the previous few minutes when I've been going through just how much power this dictatorship has, in contrast to just how little power you being able to vote every 4 or 5 years for some councillor or member of parliament, or in American terms, local council, state Congress, state House of Representatives, state Senate, national House of Representatives, federal level Senate or president, just how little power we as atomized individual proletarians, reduced to that amorphous term, the voter, just how little power you actually have over this system. Because voting gives you no power. Nothing. Yeah, I mean, there is an old phrase, which is if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. But like many truisms, it has the benefit of starting off with some truth, which is that they're quite happy for the proletariat to grudgingly turn out every 4 years to vote for these various levels of the bourgeois state, which actually changes nothing because they've got it all sewn up already. And when one of the things that I realized after my own failed experiments in electoralism with various organizations was that the guy who used to slam the door in your face and say, no, I'm not bothering voting, it won't change anything, or they're all the same, or these offices have no power. Well, those people who say those things, they're much more right than I was. Because, again, study the masses and learn from them, to use Mao's old phrase. The masses in these bourgeois dictatorships, which is what we're dealing with here, they know very well that their lives, the condition of their workplace, the condition of their communities, either don't change or get worse, whether it's Labour or Tory or Republican or Democrat. They know that the culture around them is shit. They know that they have no power in the workplace. They know that the unions are taking them for a fucking ride. Again, as I've said many times, they might not necessarily have all the language to express this or know the way to actually combat it because they don't know about or aren't familiar with Marxist-Leninism, or maybe even are hostile to it, which many are because of what they've heard about it, because of the bullshit the bourgeoisie talks about it. But they know they're being shafted, and this reinforces the fact that what I want to get over here, which is that this fetishization of the abstract concept of democracy by many on the left, or almost all of the left, in fact, going back to the days of the Second International, and then unfortunately reoccurring again in the days of the peak period of welfare capitalism, which is after World War II, where a new generation of parties, this time the communist parties, degenerate into revisionism, and then reformism, and then outright pro-capitalism, which is what happened to the Italian Communist Party, which ultimately, as I've said before, ends up being liquidated by its own leaders, who were like Gorbachevists, and the French Communist Party, which degenerated into social democracy and never recovered. And this all happened within the space of 30 years. Between the early 1950s and the early 1980s, all these parties degenerated into a complete reformist mess. Because they ended up going down the same road, going down the same path as the Second International parties, who they had sought to supplant. The French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, the Spanish Communist Party, all played incredibly heroic roles in the Spanish Civil War and then World War II. They led and paid a huge price for leading the resistance movements in places like Italy and France, as the German Communist Party paid an incredibly heavy price for its actions in Germany. So no one should ever take that away or seek to detract from it, because it's a heroic history that should be respected. However, the heroic history does not excuse what happened afterwards, which is, of course, all of them started to do the same things as Karl Kautsky. And again, Enver Hoxha points this out in very forceful terms in his work on Eurocommunism, which is they all started babbling on about democracy without, of course, properly analyzing, well, what kind of democracy are we talking about here? Are we talking about a proletarian democracy, a people's democracy, or are we talking about capitalist democracy? And of course, what they were all doing was maneuvering themselves till eventually they got to the point where they were just openly endorsing bourgeois democracy. And out of that, of course, grew the works of Santiago Carrillo, the Euro-communist leader in Spain, Enrico Berlinguer, both of whom, especially Carrillo, started arguing that there would never be any need for a revolution because Europe had reached the point where dictatorship was off the agenda, and there would be no need for proletarian uprisings, and we could distance ourselves from the horrible past of the violent years of Stalinism. You know the story. You know the bullshit that these people come out with. And of course, all of that was untrue. All of that was manifestly proven to be bullshit within 10 years of Carrillo saying that. But it did the damage. It damaged the Spanish Communist Party to the point where it's still basically now just an adjunct to the Spanish equivalent of the Labour Party, the PSOE. And of course, it destroyed the Italian Communist Party and terminally damaged the French Communist Party to the point now where the French communists who are doing the interesting work are those who are looking to replace it and kill it off once and for all. And as for the Communist Party of Britain, don't even get me started. An unholy mess which I will not mention much. But again, what were they doing? They were fostering the illusion that just because a period of welfare capitalism had been embarked upon, that the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie was in any less respects slacker, was any less of an iron grip, because it was an iron grip. Yes, it had been challenged by the success of the Russian Revolution, by the strength of the Soviet Union after 1945. But of course, with the creeping in of revisionism, then all of the tendencies of opportunism regrew in these parties and reasserted themselves again. So the point here that I want to conclude on this part of tonight is to say that the opportunist trend reoccurs, and it reoccurs always using the same language, and it all reoccurs all for the same reasons, which is you end up, when you get these, whether it's a old social democratic party or a supposedly communist party that becomes institutionalized, that has huge trade unions attached to it, that goes into a long-term presence within a capitalist state structure, the temptations of reformism and revisionism become incredibly strong. And the labor aristocracy element, even if it might have been quite weak at first, grows back, and you end up with that labor aristocracy layer carrying out all the same betrayals that the Second International did. And now I'll turn to the concluding part here, which is to talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat itself. What I've explained so far is, of course, where the terms like democracy comes from, why it needs to always be attached to, well, what kind of class is using this democracy, why the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is so all-encompassing and so powerful, and how the brief attempts at challenging it from the proletariat via the trade union movement and via the welfare capitalist period, why these ended in failure, and why, of course, revisionism and reformism grow back in communist parties. So let's turn now to look at the dictatorship of the proletariat, something which the revisionists and the reformists say is terrible. The Euro-communists couldn't denounce it enough. But what is the dictatorship of the proletariat? It's quite simple, really. It's the rule of the working class. It's the rule of the working class to be carried out as ruthlessly and effectively as the current dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is carried out on behalf of that class. And of course, the dictatorship of the proletariat is an infinitely more progressive dictatorship than that of the bourgeoisie. But dictatorship just literally means that this is the rule of this class. It's the uninterrupted and unmediated rule of this class, if possible, or that this class should be in the dominant position in a society, in a country, and that its rule should be supported via the institutions of a workers' state, and that its class enemies should be suppressed. It is essentially, and if I'm going to boil this down as far as I can, it is essentially a call for the proletariat to have at its disposal a workers' state in the initial period of the post-revolution, of the period after the political dispossession of the bourgeoisie, a state that it can wield to crush the resistance of the bourgeois, just the same way that the bourgeois wield their state to crush the resistance of the proletariat and the peasantry and other subordinated classes, mainly the proletariat and the peasantry, though. And that is it in a nutshell. And the arguments against it that come from the opportunists, from the revisionists, always basically come down to the fact that these people have become anti-revolutionary, that they have become pro-capitalist, and that the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat frightens them, because if properly applied, it would mean, of course, no more big money job for them. And of course, it would mean the having to wage a relentless and unremitting class struggle upon, as Mao identified when he's talking about the fact that the class struggle intensifies after the revolution, that would be the role of the Communist Party to lead that struggle against the lingering elements of the bourgeoisie and their influence in society. And of course, when you are leading a revolution, when you are creating this dictatorship of the proletariat, you then have to, of course, make sure that you are properly implementing one of course, the Mao's tradition, great innovations or realizations, which is the mass line. You have to go from the masses to the party and back again. You have to make sure that the Communist Party, which is both leading the masses and constantly learning from the masses and is embedded in the masses, and through that constant interaction with the masses, the dictatorship of the proletariat is shaped and enforced via the mobilization of the proletariat, and if necessary, if the relations in the country dictate that, the peasantry as well. And that's the crux of this, which is that in this post-revolutionary period, like in the Soviet Union in the early days, there's not only a lot of holdouts from the old ruling class, but also because they were in a world where they were faced with a damaged but still incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous imperialist power. That imperialist power was not only going to attempt open sabotage, military aggression, and all of the other things that we are very well aware of, but its power in terms of its ability to win over disenchanted elements to it via the sheer weight of its economic appeal and its cultural appeal. And one of the things that both Stalin and Mao realized when it comes to the struggle regarding the waging of the class war after the revolution and the continual waging of it after the revolution was that the masses would have to struggle to stop the re-emergence of pro-capitalist elements within the party and within the state. And Stalin knew that and was very aware of it. If you read his last work on economic problems of socialism in the Soviet Union, he's very aware of that, and he's talking about in there pro-capitalist elements that emerge, and they emerge in the form of like these theoretical errors in the teaching of economics, which Stalin's criticizing. And Mao, of course, knew it. He was much more open about it, and of course waged a struggle for a long period of time, the last struggle of his life, against the capitalist roaders, as he called them, a struggle which ultimately, I would say, partially failed. It only partially failed, of course, because it did ultimately strengthen the Communist Party of China, or at least strengthen the revolutionary wing, so that Deng Xiaoping and the other revisionists had to fight a lot harder to get their way in terms of pro-capitalist changes. And ultimately, the revolutionary wing was still strong enough to resist an attempt by the Chinese Gorbachev, a guy called Zhao Jiang, to try and collapse the People's Republic of China in 1989 in the events that surrounded what has become known as the Tiananmen Square incident. I've covered that before, but I'm happy to talk about it again if any comrades have any questions. So the dictatorship of the proletariat, after the revolution, necessitates the struggle of the masses to not just establish socialism, but to build the workers' state, to make sure that the party and the state remain on course, and to be able to mobilize the masses as the rulers of this state against pro-capitalist elements. And of course, this is where the Dengists, if they're here, would start screaming about how this was terrible, this led to chaos, it led to good comrades being persecuted, etc. Now, of course, the Cultural Revolution merits probably about 3 hours a discussion all on its own. And I'm not going to come here and claim that this was some perfect process, because if it was, then capitalist relations wouldn't have been restored in China in the way that they have. However, the idea that, as the Dengists say, that this was all just chaos and madness and nothing was achieved, well, it turns out there were a lot of revolutionary processes going on in China at the time, in both town, city, and of course out in the rural areas, where a lot of advances towards socialism were made. And there were some real innovations going on. And of course, the economy continued to grow after the initial disturbances throughout that period of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. So the way the Dengists present this isn't correct. And the way it's presented also, it must be said, in certain elements of the Chinese Party's own teaching of this is also incorrect. And the way, I'm going to be rather blunt now, that a lot of supporters of the Chinese system represent this in the West is also incorrect, because they just take their lead from the Chinese Party. Now, I will say here that, of course, when it comes to defense of the Chinese system against imperialism, we stand with the Chinese Party and the Chinese proletariat every single time. But those of us who are Marxist-Leninists, those of us who consider ourselves revolutionaries, are not here to be cheerleaders or fanboys. We're very clear upon why we support the victory of the Russian Federation over the NATO bloc, why we support governments like, well, the military government in Niger or Burkina Faso or Guinea or Mali against the attempts by French neocolonialism to overthrow them. We're very clear on why we back the reunification of China in terms of the full reunification by the reincorporation of Taiwan into the PRC. And we back the PRC against US imperialism. But again, we're not here to be fanboys of any of these places, but we unequivocally defend them against imperialism. But we also have to understand the contradictions that do exist within them. That's why I've spent so much time researching and going over the different elements that make up the Putin government in Russia. It's why we should all read and learn about the processes as far as we can within the language barriers that do exist, about the processes going on within the CPC in China. You have to understand these things properly, and I'll give you a very blunt example as to what happens if you don't. I've been reading recently a lot of the official works of the various ideologists that were employed by the old Soviet Union in the various academies that they ran. Some of these books, which you can find online, I've put some of them on the Marx Engels Lenin Institute website. Books by like Alexander Spirkin and others who are talking about, they write about like introductions to dialectics and things like that. So the some elements of these educational books written in that period in the Soviet Union are very good, in that they give you a good introduction to dialectics and historical materialism and the basic elements of how the Marxist system works. Others of them are absolutely terrible, because they defend like Brezhnevite concepts like developed socialism, the state of all the people. They're interesting for somebody like me who's doing research into this kind of thing, but because they show you just how the ideological rot that gave birth to Gorbachevism came about. It was already there under Brezhnev. It was already there under Khrushchev. And for many people in the communist parties of the West, they just defended unequivocally anything that happened in the Soviet Union and didn't actually analyze it very well. And so when Gorbachevism came along, they started supporting that. And then when Gorbachev pulled the plug, these people were all left high and dry, pissing in the wind, to mix my metaphors there. And it was an ideological blow and a very practical political blow from which they never recovered. So whilst we support all these different countries against imperialism without equivocation, we still have to analyze them and understand the processes that are at play there in order that we can not be caught out in the same way that millions were with the sudden implosion of the USSR. We have to understand the process. So, concluding on the point before I take questions regarding the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat is an absolute necessity, not just in the initial period where it is necessary to suppress the counter-revolutionary forces of the old bourgeoisie. It is necessary to then intensify that class struggle to stop these tendencies re-emerging again, as they have done in even the major centers of revolution, such as the USSR and China. And of course, perhaps the only successful example of where they've been consistently suppressed would be the DPRK. A very interesting example. Maybe that's why it's never talked about except in very negative terms, and even then very briefly. But the other, of course, part of this is the dictatorship of the proletariat has to go over into being as full spectrum as the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie does, which means that the proletariat has to have complete control over the information supply, over how things are written about, so control over the media, control over cultural production. So you have to extend this proletarian power, the proletarian democracy, over how news is produced, how culture is produced, how all facets of culture is produced, how all facets of life are structured, and of course, as Stalin says in his book on economic problems of socialism, how relations in the factory and in the workplace are constructed, because it is in there that, of course, we are creating and recreating our proletarian ideology, if we can, by building new relations of production, proletarian relations of production. And this is, of course, incredibly important, and it's one of the things that Khrushchev immediately reversed on when he was able to gain power and started reimposing capitalist relations of production inside the Soviet Union, which led to demoralization, collapse of labor productivity, and of course the answer from the revisionist was even more restoration of capitalist production norms. So the dictatorship of the proletariat has to run over as many aspects of society as the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie does, if we are to resist the attempts both from outside, from the imperialists, and from inside via those who degenerate into becoming agents of the imperialists, and their attempts to restore capitalism one way or another. And the proletariat must be prepared to be mobilized against the enemies of the revolution, both external and internal. And in order to create and recreate a new proletarian culture, we have to make sure that, as I said, this dictatorship runs over all aspects of life. We are seeking to impose working class power over every single aspect of society, which you started to see in some areas of the world in the 40s, 50s, and even in the 60s, with revolutions in, of course, the Soviet Union and China, and then the DPRK and Cuba. You used to have seen examples of this, but it's something that we will need to do more of, and we should be incredibly open about the fact that we advocate for the dictatorship of the proletariat. We reject the woolly-minded opportunistic garbage about pluralism and stuff like that, which all comes in the 60s, all as basically connected to the relentless drive towards both the West and left, and unfortunately the parties of the people's democracies in the East, becoming more and more pro-capitalist. We must unapologetically stand for the dictatorship of the proletariat, for proletarian power being imposed upon all aspects of life. And of course, this is a much more inherently progressive dictatorship than that of the bourgeoisie, because of course the proletariat represents the overwhelming majority in society. And so, again, this is something which most of the Western left is not willing to defend anymore, but we must bring back this concept and not just defend it, but be proud to advocate for it. We advocate for a society that is completely dominated by the working class. Just as the bourgeoisie seeks to defend their dictatorship, so we must enthusiastically advocate for ours in the future. I will now pause for various questions. Okay. Wow. Sneaks, I'm sorry to hear about that. I hope you're able to get hold of some nourishment. Jesus. Hello to Austin. How late am I? Not sure. I've kind of lost track of the comments. Hello, Dingo Ate Me Baby, the person with the greatest name in the chat. Hello to James, who says the illusion of inclusion. That's capitalism for you. Red Star Betty says the illusion of a multi-party state when they're all just flavors of the same bourgeois ice cream. Yeah, and it's all vanilla, and not even very good vanilla. President Jesus says Joe Sims of CPUSA called dictatorship of the proletariat the worst phrase ever uttered by a political theorist. Well, is Sims one of the modern leaders of the CPUSA? Because I wouldn't be surprised. The CPUSA is as rotten and degenerated as the CPB. So this is unsurprising that they would come up with that, given that they degenerated into opportunism probably from the 50s onwards. Red Star Betty asks, is that the guy who went on Glenn Beck? I don't know, did he? Hello to Movie Maker Joe. Red Star Betty says, I recall seeing someone from CPUSA making a fool of himself on there anyway. Could have been a previous leader, though. Well, if you're talking about foolish leaders of the CPUSA, there's quite a few to choose from. Yeah. CPUSA joke party, says PM. That is correct. The degeneracy of others' imperialism is ceaseless, says Movie Maker Joe. Why revolutionaries have to do better because of degeneracy and difference of imperialism? Yep. Question from Ben. Who has written about properly analysing whether it is useful to participate in bourgeois elections, balancing positives of reaching workers with negatives of validating the bourgeois dictatorship? Well, there's the old classic, which is the left-wing communist study on the United Front by Dimitrov from the 1930s. Those are two things talking about the United Front strategy and how to work in bourgeois systems. The question about when you stand in bourgeois elections and when you don't is always a tactical one, because our strategy is never going to be elections until communism, is it? So again, you've got to do a cost-benefit analysis of this, to use the rather crude capitalist term. After 1907, it made sense for the Bolsheviks to stand for the Duma, even though the Duma had essentially very little power and was dominated by the representatives of Tsardom. The Bolsheviks still guessed rightly that it was better to use the opportunity to campaign and talk to workers and use what little legality was available to them. And the thing about that, though, is, of course, they never for a minute, unlike the Mensheviks, started trying to sow illusions in this. Some did, of course. Some of the Bolshevik representatives in the Duma, I think, did go somewhat rogue, but Lenin and the majority in the Bolsheviks were able to argue that around again. So it always comes with risks doing this kind of thing. But the key thing to remember, I think, and Lenin makes this absolutely clear in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, is that it's a tactical question. Whereas, of course, our friends in the CPB over here will tell you that, no, it's a strategy. No, we've got to vote in a workers' government with communists present in it via bourgeois democracy, and that's our way to socialism. So for them, it has become a strategy. It's become the only strategy. Whereas for us, for Marxist-Leninists, it has to be, well, where is the struggle at the moment? You have to do this job of constantly assessing, where is the working class at? Is it beneficial to use this campaign to talk to more workers? Because sometimes it's not even about winning. It's not even about actually getting into parliament. It's about, can we use this campaign to do something with? So again, it's always a tactical question, the question of whether you run in a bourgeois election or not. And there's all those usual factors we have to bring into it to reach our conclusion through our internal debates. Beju says, well, hello to Beju in Barnet. As an ordinary trade union member, how can I effectively organise within that union and spread Marxism to bring about real change for the ordinary workers? Well, the question of that, this is a difficult one because like actual Marxists in trade unions these days are very thin on the ground. In the past, it used to be possible, I mean, I'm talking a long time in the past now, to join up with like a broad left organization. Tell you what, Beju, if you're agreeable to this, why don't I take that and put it into a much longer response in the Q&A to be done on Saturday, because that merits an entire show to its, or entire 20 minutes to itself, and we're getting on a bit now. So if you're agreeable, I'll pick that up on the Saturday Q&A. Sneaks, I'm sorry to hear you can't find anything to eat, mate. That's grim stuff over there. Sorry I can't do anything for you, mate. President Jesus says actually that the clown concerned earlier was the co-chair of the CPUSA. So CPUSA clown car confirmed again. Ash in Australia says the most annoying vote strategy is vote Oz Labour so they can be exposed for who they are. Yeah, well, that's I'm not sure if that's better or worse than what we have over here, which is vote Labour because the alternative is fascism, which, again, I'm going to quote Stalin to say social democracy is objectively the moderate wing of fascism, because as when Stalin wrote that, the bourgeoisie was already moving towards fascism, and the leadership of the Social Democrats essentially just is a pale echo of the left of the bourgeoisie. So, of course, they'd moved towards an objectively fascist position as well. Okay, I'll pick up Beju's question now. You're agreeable to that, so I'll pick it up on Saturday then. It was Sam Webb, the CPUSA leader, who went on Glenn Beck's show in 2009. Well, I'm sure that was an absolute car crash. Bloody hell. As far as I know, Webb is an absolute clown, or was an absolute clown, and Glenn Beck is a paid clown. So I'm sure that was an absolute horror show of opportunism and hysteria. Right, it's getting on towards midnight here in the land of perfidious Albion, and I've been going for about an hour and 15 or so. So I'm going to call it a day now. This is something which is the audio for this will be on the Patreon site by tomorrow morning. But until tomorrow, I will say thank you to everybody who has joined in tonight. So that's Red Star Betty, Lavitz, Sneaks, Ash, Comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project, Comrade Beju out in Barnet, Slava out in Chicago, James Graham, Roddy Keenan, PM, Ben Kavanagh, thanks for the question, President Jesus, Movie Maker Joe, and yes, I think that's everybody covered. So thank you for tuning in. Please join me again for tomorrow's live stream, which will be back on our perhaps traditional terrain of questions and answers, specifically over Ukraine and related issues. So hope you'll join me for that one. Keep an eye out for the Q&A coming out on Saturday as well.